Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. We are from Group 9 and we would like to present about assessing grammar and vocabulary. Members of Group 9 are me, Irdinisa Esmerida, and then Dian Ayu Fitrianti, Hasna Rahmawati, Yuni Nur Setiana, and Shafa Zahra Afrianza. On this presentation, we would like to talking about the first section is introduction. Introduction are including understanding form, focus assessment, assessing grammar, defining grammatical knowledge, and then the second section is about selective response. The third section, limited production, and the fourth section, extended production, and the last is about assessing vocabulary. Understanding form, focus assessment. Assessing grammar and vocabulary is more technically known as a focus on grading form. Assessing speaking, for example, when the teacher may be interested in the production of students' words, stress patterns, or verb tenses. In this discussion of grading writing is called attention to spelling, grammar transformation, and vocabulary. All of these are from focus assessment, and such a focus comprises important and valid criteria for language assessment in the same way. The focusing on the form of teaching is also an integral aspect of methodological communicative language teaching. Paradigm of communicative is focusing in what does it mean to know the grammar, vocabulary, phonology, and discourse rules of the language. How does that knowledge, whether explicit or implicit, influence the developing abilities of learners to use language in the real world? How does one assess grammar? Is it appropriate to purpose to test one's ability to comprehend or process vocabulary? How can a teacher assess a student's implicit knowledge of forms? Must such knowledge be assessed through explicit focus on form? Assessing grammar. Assessing grammar and vocabulary is changing. Much of the debate centers on the place of teaching grammar in language classes. Over the years, the focus on grammar has changed depending on the teaching method. For example, the grammar translation method is more about learning the structure of a language than using the communicative purpose. The communicative language teaching era of the 1980s and 1990s used an approach to the language teaching that emphasized meaning and fluency, and in some cases focus on form was lost in Shafa. Today, the goal of communicative language teaching is to help language learners communicate effectively in the real world. However, most communicative approaches recognize that grammatical competency is an integral part of language use, and therefore they advocate attention to teaching grammar. The grammatical competency assessment of students also experiences change in over time. For example, in the grammar translation paradigm, the test consists of the learner's ability to pronounce grammar rules, provide an accurate translation of text, or provide grammatically accurate words. Currently, grammar knowledge is evaluated with the correct or proper use of communication through listening, speaking, reading, writing in the second language. Defining grammatical knowledge. Grammatical competence is defined as knowledge of the rules of phonology, lexical, syntax, and semantics, but the model does not clearly show us how these are related. The grammar conceptualization of knowledge consists of three interrelated elements. First, the grammatical form, or structure of a language. Form is the morphology or how words are formed, and the syntax, how the words are arranged. Morphology and syntax are concerned with the linguistic accuracy of language. Second, the grammatical meaning of the forms. The grammatical meaning consists of the literal and the intended message conveyed by the form. Third, its pragmatic meaning, or used in a particular context. The pragmatic or implied meaning result from the correct language choices the learners make during a particular communicative event. Grammatical knowledge A form, meaning, and usage occurs at the sentence level and outside the sentence, which is usually called the level discourse. Discourse constraints include rules for cohesion, and that information management and interactional knowledge, which identify relationship in the language at the level of discourse. Pragmatic meaning depend on the contextual, sociolinguistic, sociocultural, psychological, and rhetorical meaning of the given context and can occur at both the sentence and the level of discourse. To assess this grammatical knowledge, we can target one or more of the features of form and meaning.
Hello, my name is Zahra Afrianza, and here we will examine different types of tests that can be used to measure this knowledge. Input for the selected response tasks can be in language or non-language, as in gesture or picture of any like from one word to several sentences of discourse. Test takers are expected to choose the correct answer, which is intended to measure knowledge of a grammatical form and grammatical meaning. These responses are often scored discontinuously 0 or 1, although sometimes depending on how the ability or constructs is defined. Practical credit scoring 0, 1, or 2 may be used. And then multiple choice text. The most common selected response text present a blank or underlined word in a sentence, and the test taker must choose the correct response from given options. And the advantages of multiple choice texts are that they are easy to administer and score, and then disadvantages of multiple choice are that they are difficult to create, can promote guessing by test taker. Okay, and then grammatical knowledge is divided into two parts. The first is grammatical form, and then the second is grammatical meaning. And then pragmatic knowledge, there is pragmatic meaning. Okay, this is an example of grammatical form. This example provides the context for the response, but because all four responses convey the intended meaning, and understanding of the context is not essential to identify the correct item. This item then is decided to assess only grammatical form, and therefore the item will be scored and either correct or wrong. This is an example of grammatical meaning. In this example, the first part asks a question about a future event. In the second part, the correct response could be any of the four options because they are all grammatically correct. But the third part of the dialogue provides context that indicate the meaning of the correct response, which refusal to a suggestion. The correct response is therefore option C. The item is designed to assess only grammatical meaning and will be scored at the right or wrong. Okay, this is example. Both the grammatical form and the meaning of the option need to be considered in order to identify the correct response. As the second part of the dialogue indicates, there is a sense of uncertainty and added to that is in indication that the visit is a future event. Both grammatical form and meaning are required. The item is scored either right or wrong. Another multiple choice task is error identification, where the input contains one incorrect or inappropriate grammatical feature in the item. And then grammatical form and meaning. In this example, the item is designed to assess grammatical form, specifically the present tense, that is needed to show habitual action of most children in the United States. These types of tasks are scored either right or wrong because the test taker needs to identify only one error. Discrimination tags. Discrimination tags are another types of selected response tags that ask the test taker to attend to input that can be either language or non-language, and to respond in the form of a choice within or among contrasts or opposite, such as true or false, right or wrong, or same or different. Discrimination items are used to measure the difference between two similar area of grammatical knowledge, such as pronouns in subject and object position. And then example of discrimination tags. In the following example, designed to test recognition of gender pronouns. The test taker must be able to discriminate between two pictures and correctly choose the picture that corresponds to the stimulus sentence. An alternative format could present one picture with two sentences, one of which correctly match the picture. Okay, and then noticing tags or consciousness raising tags. These tags contain a wide range of input in the form of language or non-language and are considered particularly helpful for learners by attending constantly to form and or meaning. Learners become aware of the extent of specific language featured in LAE. Okay, and then the last example. In these types of tags, test takers are asked to indicate, underline, or circle that they have identified a specific feature in the language sample.
The next is about designing assessment tasks in limited production. In limited production tasks, the input in the item is language information. The input could be a single sentence or longer stretch of discourse. There are three types in limited production tasks. The first one is gap filling task. The language is presented in the form of sentence, dialogue, or passage in which a number of words are deleted. The deletions are made to the test one or more areas of grammatical knowledge, such as vocabulary knowledge and grammatical ability. Test takers must choose the appropriate response for the deletion or gap based on the context in which the language is presented. Here the example of gap filling task. The second is short answer task. The test taker will see a question or reading with the question. Test taker must provide a response that is both grammatically correct and meaningful in terms of the question asked. Here the example of short answer task. And the last is dialogue completion task. The test taker presented a short conversation or dialogue in which a part of the exchange and or the entire exchange is left blank and the expected response is meant to be grammatically correct. The correct response requires that the test taker understand the information in the conversation that is provided by the other participant. In the first of two exchanges, the past tense marker were in both examples. The correct response requires that the test taker understand the information in the conversation that is provided by the other participant. In the first of the two exchanges, the past tense marker was in "How was your trip to Los Angeles?" indicate to the test taker that the event is past and therefore the response must also be in the past tense. In addition, the test taker must understand that the response must be in positive because The next part of the dialogue indicates a pleasant trip. Likewise, in the second example, when the customer requires a certain beverage, the test taker must provide the response of the server based on the next U-turns of the customer.
The next is designing, assessing, test, extended production. The input can vary in length and can be either language or non-language gesture or picture information. The purpose of extended production is to obtain large amount of language from the test taker and to allow for more creative construction. This is the picture about typical 5-point scale for evaluating grammatical knowledge. The next is information gap test. Information gap test is one test taker is given half or some of the information and another the task taker is given complementary information. The reciprocal nature of the performance requires the test taker to display politeness, formality, appropriateness, and other conversational convention. The task aim to measure test takers' knowledge of question formation, other interaction, form, and meaning, and to use such as requests for clarification and repair. This is the picture about the example from information gap task. The next is role-play or simulation task. Role-play or simulation task, the input in role-play task present test takers with a language or non-language prompt that asks them to take on a role or to simulation a situation in order to solve a problem, make a decision, or perform some transaction collaboratively. An example of a problem solving roleplay is given below. The prompt describes an issue that needs to be resolved and suggests why to solve the problem. The prompt also specifies 3 possible roles that test taker could take on as part of the problem solving. The next is assessing vocabulary. The nature of vocabulary. We immediately think of words. They identify words as token or types. Token are all the words in the paragraph, which in this case total 45. The type, on the other hand, do not count words that are repeated, only words that are of different form. Function, word, preposition, article, conjunction, and other little words are seen as belonging more to the grammar of the language than vocabulary. The author identified 4 types of lexical phrase. The first is polyword, second is institutionalized expression, the third is phrasal constraints, the last is sentence builders.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I am Yuni Nur Setiana. I will continue this presentation about the next point of assessing vocabulary. The second point of assessing vocabulary is defining lexical knowledge. Nation in 1990, 2001, and 2013 took Richard in 1976 approach further by specifying the scope of the learner's task to include the distinction between receptive and productive vocabulary knowledge. We may be able to recognize a word when we see or hear it. Production of a word requires a different and perhaps more complex set of abilities from those needed for reception of a word, so both modes of performance need to be taken into account in assessment. Richard, in 1976, outlined a series of assumptions about vocabulary ability that developed out of linguistic theory. There are: number 1 is the native speaker of a language continues to expand his or her vocabulary in adulthood, whereas syntax developed comparatively little in adult life. Number 2 is knowing a word means knowing the degree of probability of encountering that word in speech or print. For many words, we also know the sort of word most likely to be found associated with the word. Number 3 is knowing a word implies knowing the limitation imposed on the use of the word according to variation of function and situation. Number 4 is knowing a word means knowing the syntactic behavior associated with that word. Number 5 is knowing a word entails knowledge of the underlying form of the word and the derivation that can be made from it. Number 6 is knowing a word entails knowledge of the word of the network of association between that word and other word in language. Number 7 is knowing a word means knowing the semantic value of the word. And the last is knowing a word means knowing many of the different meanings associated with the word. Capelli in 1994 and 2006 accounted for both the explicit knowledge of vocabulary and the ability, more implicit, to put vocabulary knowledge to use in a given context. 3 components make up Capelli's definition of vocabulary ability. Number 1 is the context of vocabulary use. Number 2 is vocabulary knowledge and fundamental processes. And the last is metacognitive strategies for vocabulary use. Vocabulary in context. Traditionally in testing, we view context as the sentence or environment in which the target word occurs. For a communicative language use position, however, context is more than just the linguistic environment in which a word occurs. It also includes different types of pragmatic knowledge. That is, the meaning of the target word has to be viewed within the social and cultural environments as well. For example, when teenagers talk about a babe, it is not a small baby, but rather a nice-looking girl. And when someone describe an event as the bomb, its description broadly equivalent to awesome or unbelievable or great. Consider Bridge 2000 example of a British American English confusion over the word to table. In British, the term to table means to discuss now. The issue is brought to the table, whereas in American English it means to differ. The issue is left on the table. In important business meetings, that difference could lead to some frustrating misunderstanding. The context of vocabulary use may vary across generation, formal and informal language, and varieties and dialect of language, as well as between non-specialized everyday vocabulary and specialized or technical vocabulary. To understand context in a more social framework, we should look at the type of activity the language user is engaged in, the social status of the participant in that activity, and finally, the channel, whether written or spoken communication, in which the language will be used. The last component is metacognitive strategies. According to Reed in 2000, points out we use a set of strategies in trying to read illegible handwriting, other strategies when we need to convey a sad message, and still other when we might be talking with a non-native speaker or our language. Second language learners often use metacognitive strategies to overcome their lack of vocabulary knowledge when they are communicating. Most often they practice avoidance, such as using alternatively lexical items, because they are not sure of the exact word to use, the correct pronunciation, or the appropriate grammatical form. Other time, second language learners will paraphrase a word fallback on their first language, use superordinate terms such as musical instrument for trombone, or even appeal to authority when they are unsure of their knowledge of vocabulary. These strategies are part of learners' ability to use words, and although these strategies themselves are rarely assessed in a formal test, they figure largely into a student level of success on vocabulary tests. At the very least, teachers can help students both to remember words and to produce them through the use of appropriate metacognitive strategies. Some consideration in designing assessment tasks. There's 4 steps you can take to design a vocabulary test. The first one is clarify your purpose. The second, define your construct. The third, select your target word. And the last, determine mode of performance. Clarify your purpose. You are already aware that the first order of business in designing tests is to clarify the purpose of the test so that we can evaluate the result in relation to the intended use of the test. For example, a test of vocabulary can be used to assess how many high-frequency words a learner already knows before he or she begins a course of study. During the course of study, a teacher can use vocabulary tests to assess learners' progress or identify vocabulary that needs further attention, and at the end of a course of study, the vocabulary test can provide information about the knowledge of lexical item a learner has studied. Define your construct. The construct definition of vocabulary knowledge can be based on either a syllabus or a theory. For many of us as teachers, the syllabus-based approach to defining the construct is more appropriate because the lexical item and the vocabulary skill to be assessed can be specified in relation to the learning objective of the course. By Reed in 2000. The theory-based construct definition is applicable for research and for assessing vocabulary proficiency. So, for example, Capel in 1994 model of vocabulary ability, which we just discussed, is one framework that can be used to define the construct of a vocabulary test. The third step is select your target word. When designing a vocabulary test, it's important to consider the selection of target word. Consider the following categories for making your choices. Nation in 1990 suggests that teaching and testing of vocabulary should be based on high-frequency words or occurring more often, because they are the basis for all provision language users. Therefore, high-frequency words are generally the most useful in assessing a learner's vocabulary ability. Low-frequency words, or occurring less often, are much less valuable, and often learners pick them up based on how widely they read, their personal interests, their educational background, the society they live in, and the communication they engage in. In the case of low-frequency words, researchers focus more on how learners effectively use strategies to cope with this lexical item when they come across them in language use. Another category is specialized vocabulary, such membrane, molecule, cytoplasm from biology, which figures more prominently in content area instruction, and assessment of this lexical item is more often found in subject matter tests than in general language tests. The last category is sub-technical words, such as cell, energy, structure, which occur across register or subject areas and can be used to assess different meaning and definition. The last step is determine mode of performance. To better understand testing of receptive and productive vocabulary, we need to clarify these terms further. We can reserve and produce vocabulary in two ways. One is recognition or comprehension, whereby learners are presented with a word and asked to show they know the meaning of that word. And the second mode is performance is recall and use, where the learner is not presented with the word but is provided with some sort of stimulus that is meant to draw out the target lexical item from the learner's memory. The learner is then asked to produce that word. The next test item of filling in the blank is an example of recall plus production. You can see the form of vocabulary recognition and vocabulary recall on the screen. Designing assessment test receptive vocabulary. Teachers often design vocabulary tests both to assess progress in vocabulary learning and to give learners feedback and encouragement to continue studying vocabulary. With classroom tests, practicality can be a significant concern, especially ease of construction and scoring. Many vocabulary tests are therefore limited to single sentences. Vocabulary in the context of a single sentence are first, it is important to consider what role the context plays in the test item. One function of the context is to indicate a specific meaning of high-frequency word. Second, the learners must be able to recognize the word based on the given context. The example of receptive vocabulary on the screen are illustrations by Reed in 2000. The first is vocabulary in a one-sentence context of high-frequency word. In this example, the test taker must be able to show understanding of the underlying adjective in the sentence. The options are all attributes of a person, and therefore knowledge of the meaning of the word itself is needed to choose the correct response. The second example, in the case of low-frequency word, even a limited context can provide information that enables the test taker to recognize and infer the meaning of the lexical item. Items need to contain some amount of conceptual information for the test taker to choose the correct response. Although all the above responses could be substituted for the underlying word, the information about the accident being fatal implies the more serious state of being dangerous. The next example is a vocabulary matching exercise. In this case, the most common approach is to investigate a learner's vocabulary size. One frequently used test to assess a learner's vocabulary size is word association. The procedure involves presenting the target word as a stimulus to test taker and asking them to say the first word that comes to mind. This methodology is currently seldom used for second language learners because researchers found the second language learners produced varying word associations that were not helpful in determining their vocabulary size. By Mira 2009 and Reed 2000. Instead, the test method was changed from asking test taker to supply the word to asking them to select a word. Here is an example taken from Reed 2000, page 181. Designing assessment tasks of productive vocabulary. In the same way that context play an important role in receptive vocabulary tasks, projective tasks, which involve recall and use, are also better performed within a context or situation. A common vocabulary test type is sentence completion, where the target vocabulary item is deleted from a sentence and the test taker must understand the context in which the word occurs in order to produce the missing word. This methodology involves recall in that the test taker must provide a lexical item from memory. Two examples of productive vocabulary. The first is fill in the blank. In the last item above, the information provided in the sentence context help the test taker to understand that the water in the river has spread beyond its banks, which then means flood. Going beyond a single sentence, longer passages provide opportunities to assess other aspects of vocabulary knowledge. Therefore, in addition to word meaning, the form and use of a lexical item can be assessed. The selective deletion clause or gap-fill test is one type of test that draws on this aspect of word knowledge. The second example is selective deletion clause. Going beyond a single sentence, longer passages provide opportunities to assess other aspects of vocabulary knowledge. Therefore, in addition to word meaning, the form and use of a lexical item can be assessed. The selective deletion clause or gap-fill test in one type of test that draws on this aspect of word knowledge. In the selective deletion clause or gap-fill test, the test taker must be able to identify not only the meaning, but also the form of the lexical item that is needed to fill in the blank. For example, in working with children who had been blah 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 away in mental blah blah blah. The first deletion indicates that the vocabulary item request for the blank is a verb and that the verb takes the base participle form. For the next deletion, the word needs to be a noun and that noun needs to be plural. In addition to meaning and form, the pragmatic meaning of vocabulary item can also be assessed. Vocabulary choice can, therefore, be dependent on the style and register of the language used. For example, for the following deletion and talk her experience with this blah blah blah, the vocabulary item is a plural noun, so both kids and children are suitable words. But the formality of the language found in the rest of the passage, because it is a written text, indicates that children rather than kids would be the better choice of lexical item. Note of this chapter that assessing grammar and vocabulary needs to be carefully understood in classroom context, especially within communicative methodology. In both teaching and assessment, focus on form plays an important role in helping students zoom in on the bits and pieces of the language they are learning. Well, that's all our presentation. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.